Hey guys, welcome to Ben Wrenchin. My name is Ben, and today I'm wrenching on my 2008 Infiniti FX35. I'm going to be doing a valve cover gasket replacement, and I've got a bit of an oil leak that has gotten worse over time, and so today I'm going to be replacing the valve cover gasket. I've got everything that I know I'm going to need, and I'm sure that there's more that I'll need as I get into it, but I suspected my oil leak was coming from the valve cover gasket. I took it to a mechanic, and they confirmed the same thing for me. I've got a new valve cover gasket. There's the part number. I got some more gaskets that we'll find as we get into this, and I wanted to replace those too. And I got a new breather tube too that I saw was a good thing to replace once you're in there. So we will go ahead and get into it. To do this, we're gonna have to take off this cover, the air box, move some wire harnesses out of the way, get both of the air plenums off, and then we'll have access to the valve covers. We can take those off and replace the gaskets. So I'm going to start by disconnecting the battery and getting this plastic cover off. Next, I'll take off this whole airbox assembly. I'll loosen this hose clamp, remove some of these fasteners holding it in, and some of these electrical connectors. Alright, so there was a bolt there, an electrical connector right here, a bolt right here, and then that hose clamp. I also disconnected that hose right there. I'm gonna go ahead and take this piece off to make it a little easier on me. Alright, next I'm going to work on taking off this upper plenum. There's an electrical connector back here next to the throttle body, some 10mm fasteners all the way around it, some in the center, and some more hoses that we'll have to take off in order to get this off. There are 3 shorter bolts on the front and 3 longer bolts on the back, so make sure you separate those out. There's one more hose in the back right here that I need to disconnect. I'm going to detach this coolant hose at the top so that I can put the spark plug in there and lose less coolant. It's a little difficult to get to, but I think I can get in there and get this off. Just using some needle nose pliers. There we go. Just trying to get in there with a pick and loosen up that hose that's kind of seized on there. And there we go. All right, so I will pull this off and plug the spark plug into it to hopefully not lose as much coolant as I can. There we go. All right, with all those bolts and nuts off, with the hoses disconnected, airbox taken off up to the throttle body, electric connection back here, and hose on this side. So there's one more line on the bottom of this throttle body. Some people I saw took off this throttle body. It's just got these 4 bolts right here. So you can do that or take that line off. I'm gonna go ahead and take off the whole throttle body. It's just got these 4 bolts. They're 5mm hex bolts. And I've got a 5mm hex bit and my 3/8 drive ratchet. So you just want to be careful with these. They're pretty brittle. This one here looks like it's stripped. So I'm going to try some vice grip pliers and see if I can turn it by grabbing it on the outside. Yes, there we go. So that got it loose. I'll have to replace that bolt. With the throttle body off, I've got way easier access to that hose here. If you're going to do this, I would suggest investing in a good set of hose clamp pliers, because this one is hard to get to, and I wished I'd have had it on a couple more clamps that I've taken off. So I would invest in those if you can. I'll link some in the description. The right tool always helps. This is definitely not the right tool for this, but it'll work. So this is the one I'm going to need a spark plug for, to plug off the coolant that runs through it. Alright, so now with all that off, that should be everything that I need to get this upper plenum off. So I'll just go ahead and lift up on both sides. I need to grab the back here. And there we go. So we got the upper off, now we can work on the lower. So with the lower, it's just got these 6 bolts in the center, and then a couple bolts on the side, these 2 here and this one here. So a few on this side, and then one hose that's going into it right here. Mine's got the hose clamp already backed off. So I'll put that where it's supposed to go when I put it back on. But I just need to disconnect this hose and get these 3 bolts off here, and then these 6 in the center, and this whole thing will come off. This gasket right here is one of them that came in the pack that I got, so I will be replacing that gasket. So I will start with this hose in the front, because once I get this off, I can just take all those bolts off and we should be good. So I'm gonna get a pick in there and try and break this loose. Helps to get 2 fingers on the end of the hose and push back as you pull on the other end of the hose. That's the best way I've found to try to get this off. There we go. These are all 10mm bolts as well. I'm gonna start with these ones on the side and then take off those 6 in the center. Alright, so I tried to go in as much of a star pattern as I could. I don't know that you need to do that, but that's what I did. I can go ahead and take this old gasket off. I usually go about 5,000 miles between oil changes, but I may think about lowering that a little bit because this looks pretty dirty. So there is a nut right here on the front. This nut right here, I'll have to take that off. I'm assuming there's one in the back too, so I'll take those off. All right, there's the one in the front. There we go. And that feels like it's loose. So I'm gonna go ahead and lift it up and take it out. All right, and with that off, we've got access to both of the valve covers. So there's one here and one there. This one is very oily and dirty on the top, and this one has the oil leaking down underneath on this side. So I do believe both of these are bad. These are made of plastic, so you want to be careful with them, but I'm going to go ahead and move some of these electrical connectors out of the way so that I can get these off. Before I do that though, I want to tape this off, so I'm going to use painter's tape and cover all of these so that nothing drops down in there. You drop a nut or a bolt down in there and then you've got a real problem on your hands. So just make sure you cover these up if you're going to do this. All right, now that I've got that taped off, I'm gonna go ahead and start on this driver's side valve cover. I've heard that this is the easier one to get off, so I'd like to do it first and see what I'm getting into, and then work on the more difficult one second. So I'll go ahead and take off some of these bolts holding on these wiring harnesses, take off these electrical connectors for the spark plug coils, get these coils out, and then start taking off these bolts on the valve cover. Alright, so I'm ready to take this valve cover off. It's got 4 10mm bolts on the top and 4 at the same spots on the bottom. So I'm going to start with the ones on the top. Here's the first one on the bottom, right next to where the dipstick goes in. The next one's right here. And the last two are back here. There's one, and then there's another one in the very back. Alright, there's one. Alright, I am down to the last bolt on this valve cover. And I can't really get a good shot of it, but I wanted to show how I got to it. And I'm reaching through here, and I got a swivel head socket onto the bolt. This is a quarter drive swivel head ratchet, and I'm just trying to break it free, and then I'll be able to get it off. But I can't get an extension from the top because of all this stuff that's there. I'm gonna have to come in this way just to try to break it loose. So I'm trying to go easy. It's probably the dirtiest one, and I don't want to strip it. So I'm really just trying to seat this socket on there really well and see if I can break it loose. But there is just no way to get a good shot of this. Oh, there we go. All right, I broke it loose. And this is the best shot I can get of me spinning this back one off by hand. All right, and there we go. So I have laid out everything that I've taken off so far in order, and I've got the bolts in order. So I started with that, disconnected the battery, took off the air box, left all the bolts for the air box over here. Then the upper plenum, these are the center bolts. The long ones go in the back, short ones go in the front, and then all of these bolts in order. And I started with this one here. So I took that one out and set it down here. This one had a nut on it. I set that down here and just went all the way around and took all those off and set them down in order because some of them are different sizes. And then I did the same with this. So there were these 3 bolts on this side of the plenum. So I took those 3 bolts off, set those down in order. That one's from the front, those 2 are in the back. Took off these 6 bolts on the center of it, and I just put the bolts back into it. And then the 2 nuts, the one on the front and one on the back. This is the gasket that was on the top. There is another one on the bottom, and both of those came in the kit that I got, so I will replace those when I put it back on. I took the throttle body off and left the bolts in it, so I know where those are at. When I took the coils out, these 3 bolts were from the wiring harness, and then I took all the coils out and set them out. That one was in the back, that one was in the front, put the bolts into those. So I have those, and then these are the 8 bolts for the valve cover. And so now I've got everything in order for when I put it back in. I like doing it like this because I can literally just take things off, set them down, and do it in order, and lay the bolts out in order that I take them out. And then when I go to put it back in, I can just start here and work my way back. So I'll get the new valve cover on, bolt it down, get the coils back in, put the wiring harness back on, put this back in, replace the gaskets, put those nuts back on to bolt it down, put these 3 on that side and this in the center, and then move on to the top and the throttle body. You have a certain pattern that you have to put those bolts back in and tighten them down to a certain torque spec, and then go through and do them all again in the same order at a higher torque spec. But then just put the rest of this back on. So that's how I take things off and put them back on. But now with all those bolts out of the valve cover, I can go ahead and take this off. I'll need to move this wiring harness out of the way enough to be able to pull the valve cover off. And if I could do this over, I would get a new valve cover. They are plastic and they're relatively cheap. I cheaped out on it and didn't get new ones, and now I wish I did. As dirty as this thing is, I'm gonna have to clean it up. And I wish I had just gotten new valve covers so that I didn't have to mess with that. But I will go ahead and get this one off and get the gasket replaced and then start putting it back together before I start on the passenger side. One thing I'm gonna have to do in order to take this off is get this tube off that connects one valve cover to the other. There's a wiring harness above that. Alright, so here's the tube at the front of the valve covers, and it is pretty stiff. I actually bought a new tube to hopefully replace this, but it doesn't look like it's quite the same shape, so I'm really hoping that I can reuse this. So I'm going to be really careful when I take this off, and hopefully I can save it. Alright, that was not so bad. There is one more bolt on this back side that I need to take off. So I can feel one more bolt right back here next to this hose. So it's angled this way. All right, there we go. So don't forget about the last bolt on the back of the valve cover. There it is. So that back bolt was down here. I'll show you when I get the valve cover off, but there is another one in the front, and it is right there, and mine is covered in oil. So it is just below the oil filler neck. So I'm gonna get that one off too, and that should be the last one for the valve cover. There we go. And now with hopefully all of the bolts off, I'm hoping that I can get this valve cover off. Oh, there we go. All right, so it is loose, and I will gently remove this, making sure not to get caught on anything that is still in there. Alright, so there it is, out of the vehicle. So I have got some cleaning up to do on this thing. So I will be cleaning up this gasket mating surface. This right here is going to need some attention. But the rest of it looks pretty good. It does not look too bad. But I will be cleaning all that up to prepare for the new gasket. So now that I've got the valve cover off, I'm going to go ahead and clean it up. I'm going to try some of this foaming engine degreaser that I got. I will link something similar to this in the description, but I got this at Tractor Supply, and it was cheap. But I'm just going to spray this whole thing and see what happens. Alright, I feel like that's pretty good. I'm gonna let this sit. And while that's sitting, I've got something else I can work on. So I noticed with this cover off, there's a part back here that bolts into the back and sticks in. It's a sensor. It's actually called the camshaft position sensor. So this is the camshaft. And I actually have this part on hand. And the reason why is because the same sensor on the other side in the back of the engine went bad on me and started doing all kinds of weird things. Felt like it was going to die. Ended up making it home. Figured out that's what it was. There was a few lights on the dash. I think a VDC light or something like that. I'll find a picture of those lights and post it up here. But that sensor came in a 2-pack, and I couldn't reach this one at that time. So I just changed the one on the other side. It fixed the problem. I went about my day, and I just remembered that I still have the other one on hand. So I'm going to go ahead and change that out. I also had to find the correct screws to screw into that. The old screw on the other one, I think it broke when I took it out. There was some reason why I just put a screw that I had on hand holding that one in when I replaced it. I did end up finding the correct screws, so I bought those, and I just never replaced the screw on that side, so I'm going to do that when I do the other cover. But there is the part number for this screw. I'll link these in the description. And I will also link these crankshaft position sensors in the description as well. But I would recommend changing those out, especially this one, because it is impossible to get to without all this removed. So I'm going to go ahead and change it out. There's just one bolt on the back side. The sensor is connected to this electrical connector here. There we go. So it's got this green tab that you've got to push down and then pull it out. It pushes down quite a bit, so you can push it down and it'll feel like it's down, but it's really not. It'll go all the way down and kind of click, and that's how you know you got it down far enough. But you just got to push down on that green clip and pop it out. There's a 10mm bolt on the back side here. I'll go ahead and take that out and replace this sensor. There we go. All right, there's the bolt, and that sensor should just pop right out now. So you can turn it side to side and that'll loosen it up better, and that'll allow you to get it out. So there is that sensor. All right, I compared the old one to the new one. They look exactly the same. You always want to compare your parts before you install new parts. And this one, as I pushed it in, it felt like it kind of clicked into place, which is nice. But I would definitely recommend doing this while you got this far, because this is going to be difficult to do without taking this valve cover off. And it feels like I got that bolt in right where it's supposed to be. Nice. So that was not bad at all with this taken apart like this. And I don't remember the torque spec for these. I know I looked it up last time I did this, so I will find that out and post it right now. I am not too worried about it. I'm just glad to be using this part that I had on hand, wondering how I was going to ever change it out, and this presented the perfect opportunity to do that. I am going to leave this disconnected because I think if I disconnect this last connector that this huge wiring harness is going to, that I think I should be able to move this out of the way, get that valve cover back on, and then reconnect all of this before I put everything back together. So I'm going to try that. These electrical connectors drive me crazy. I really need to invest in a good set of electrical connector pliers. They make some that help you to push down on these tabs as you're pulling these out, but some of these are really difficult. There we go. All right, so that's what that last one looks like. But with that out, I think that should help me move this whole wiring harness out of the way. I should be able to have enough clearance to get the valve cover back on way easier. And then hopefully remember everything that I disconnected and reconnect all of it. So at this point, I'd like to clean off this mating surface. I'm going to scrape as much as I can off of there and try not to get any inside the engine. But I want to get this cleaned off as best I can so that it gets a real good seal with that new gasket. So I'll just go all the way around and take my time. I'm using a plastic scraper so that I don't damage any of this mating surface. And I will just take my time and scrape it all off away from the valve body. I'm gonna go ahead and move this dipstick out of the way. I'm gonna take off this piece where the dipstick goes in. It's pretty dirty and I don't like seeing that every time I do an oil change. So while I'm here and this is easy to do, I'm gonna go ahead and take this off and clean it as well. So that was not difficult at all to remove, but mine is pretty grimy and could use a good cleaning. So I'm gonna do that. All right, so I've let this valve cover sit for a while and degrease. I'm gonna go ahead and hit it again with this degreaser. And now I'm just going to start scrubbing away. All right, now we'll go ahead and start taking this gasket off. All right, there we go. So I'll go ahead and clean up this side of it. There's quite a bit of gunk and grime in there. Traded out the cardboard for an old kitty litter pan. And I feel like I can use this to just kind of soak this a little bit and clean it up a little bit better. It actually looks pretty good. Surprised I got it this clean, and I'll be happy with how it's going to look once I'm done. And I'm just going to keep scrubbing on this and get it as clean as I can before I put it back on. And for this side, I really just want to make sure I get out any chunks that are still left inside this groove. So stuff like this, I want to get that out. I want to be careful with this pick because it's sharp and metal, but I do want to try to fish out anything that I can. Looks like there's some spots of some RTV. I've got some Honda Bond that I'm going to use because I just used that on my Honda valve cover, and I'm sure it's good enough for this application. So I'm just going to go around and get some of this old crusty stuff off and clean this side up as well. This stuff right here is a really good example of what I want to try to get off so that I can put new gasket maker on here. This doesn't look like it's going to come off, and I don't want to scrape too hard, but I do want to try to get this off if I can. That way I can get a new seal on these corners. So I'll keep working on this and see if I can get this off. I got the valve cover cleaned up pretty well. Doesn't look too bad actually. So I used a toothbrush and just scrubbed this side and cleaned it up with the engine degreaser and kept scrubbing on it and just made sure that I got everything out of that groove and there's nothing left. There is some old gasket sealer on it still that I couldn't get off, but I can't go with that with a metal razor blade, so I'm just gonna leave that. But I think it looks pretty good. I'll let it sit overnight so it could dry, make sure it's completely dry before I try to put the new gasket in there. And so now I'm just working on this mating surface here on the engine side. I got it cleaned up pretty well. I just used an old towel and wiped it all off, and it looks pretty good. All of it except these top two corners where you put the gasket sealer. So to put the new cover on, I'm going to put some gasket sealer right here and down in this corner as well, right there. I went ahead and scraped this corner off with a metal razor blade, and I'm going to show the same process for this corner here. I've still got some old gasket sealer on there that I'm going to get off. So you just want to go at it very lightly, very slowly, very carefully, making sure not to score that metal at all. And so I'll just go at this very slowly until I get all of this off. And I can't say how important it is to go lightly, go slowly, and be very careful. So I'll go ahead and get the rest of that off and then clean it one more time and we'll be ready to put the new gasket in. Alright, so I think that is good enough. I got as much as I could off of those mating surfaces. They're pretty hard to get to in all those curves, but you just want to make sure that you get all of it off of this right here. So this being the mating surface, and all the way to down here. You just want to make sure that this is clean. I tried to get all this out of the corner, but I can't really get it very well. And as I pick at it, it flings right back into the engine. So I'm going to get these specks out of here. Some stuff like this that I can see in there. And get as much of that out as I can. And I wiped it one more time with a towel. And I feel like it looks pretty good all the way around. So I've got this cleaned up as good as it's going to look in order to get the new gasket on. So I'll go ahead and put the new gasket in the cover, and then I will put the sealer in here right before I put the cover back on. So this is my new Fel-Pro gasket. It came in a pair because there are two covers, and I will link this in the description. So there we go, new gasket installed. And I'm just going around and pushing it down across the whole gasket to make sure that it gets a really good seat. And hopefully then it'll stay in place. It doesn't look too bad, so I think it's going to stay in there long enough for us to install it. So that's good news. All right, so I'm ready to put my gasket sealer in there. I'm going to start right here and just work my way down. And then do the same on this side. Alright, so it doesn't look the best, but I think it's good enough. So those are the only two places that you need to put gasket sealer. I'm using Honda Bond because I have some from doing my Honda valve cover gasket not too long ago. So we're going to put the valve cover back on real quick before that gets a chance to set. So one last time, I'm just going to make sure that this gasket is completely seated in all areas, and then I will try to put it on in one motion. There we go, got it back in. That really wasn't too bad. So I'm gonna go ahead and grab the bolts and start putting them in there. I'm not gonna tighten them down yet. I'm just gonna put them on and get them pretty much hand tight and let the gasket sealer cure, and then I'll torque them down to spec. I'm gonna start with the front and the back bolts. So I'll just work on getting these started. All right, I got both of those started. Now I'll work on the bolts on the top and the bottom. The back bottom one is pretty difficult to see, but I can reach in through here and tighten it down by hand. And then once I get it tightened that far, I can go in with a socket later and tighten it down the rest of the way. All right, so all of those are hand tight. While I'm letting the gasket sealer set, I can put a few things back on that I took off. One being where the dipstick goes in, and some of these electrical connectors in the back that I took off in order to be able to get this cover on easier. So I did get this thing where the dipstick goes in way cleaner than it was, so I'm happy about that. It was just this one bolt on it, so it really wasn't hard to take off, but it was dirty. So I'll go ahead and get this back into place. What I will do is start tightening this bolt down and hope that it finds itself into place. That looks pretty good. All right, there we go. That didn't look bad. So I'll go ahead and tighten that down. And that's back in. All right, so I'll go ahead and tighten these down just a little bit more. The torque spec on these is 60 to 82 inch-pounds. 82 inch-pounds is just under 7 foot-pounds, which is basically nothing. So I'm just gonna go ahead and tighten these down just a little bit, and then I will get my torque wrench and show you what 7 foot-pounds looks like. So my big torque wrench won't register that low. It says it goes down to 10. I even set it at 11 and went at one of these bolts, and it didn't feel like it was clicking. So I just went around and tightened these all to the same based on feel, and they feel tight. We're just tightening plastic into aluminum, so it doesn't have to be really tight. We just want to make sure we get a good seal and that all of these bolts are tightened down uniformly. So I did that. I double checked the back one last to make sure that it was still tight. When you tighten these down, you'll go back around and some will feel even looser since the rest of them have tightened down more. So you just want to double check all of them again before you feel like they're all tight. So that feels pretty good. I'm ready to put the coils back in and also connect some of these electrical connections. This big green one in the back, I'm going to plug back in. And then this crankshaft position sensor, I can plug this one back in as well. All right, got both of those in. Now a lot of the rest of this I can bolt back together as we get more covers back on. But right now I think everything looks pretty good. So I will go ahead and get the coils back in, and then we'll put some of these wiring harnesses back where they're supposed to go too. All right, coils are back in, and now I can plug these coil packs back in. So you just want to make sure you get the right one into each one. It's pretty obvious. This one's going backwards because it goes into this one. These two are coming forward, and there's one further back than the other one. But just double check and make sure you get these back in the right place. There we go. And I can see where all these brackets line up. So I'm ready to put these bolts back in, these wiring harness brackets. And that feels pretty good. All right, so with the driver's side cover back on, I'm gonna work on this passenger side cover. There are quite a few more wiring harnesses to take off on this side, so I'm gonna start on those, see how many I gotta take off, and then get this cover off. Okay, I will save you a half hour. So I worked forever to try to get that bolt right there out. I need to get that out to move this wiring harness, and I can't get it to move because it's attached right there. I tried removing everything else that I could to give it some slack. I removed this bracket here, which gave it a little bit more slack, thinking eventually I'd be able to lift it up further, and I really just couldn't. So I started working on trying to get this bolt out, and I finally did break it loose. I used the smallest ratchet that I have and the smallest 10mm socket that I have, and went at it from the other side. So I came in here and pushed this wiring harness forward a little bit until I could get this socket onto that bolt and turn it. So I tried every extension I've got, universal extensions, all kinds of stuff, and nothing worked. That was the only way I could get it to break loose. And now I'll be able to move this whole thing once I get that bolt out. All right, back at it again. Here's where I'm at with getting this side off. I've gotten a few of the wiring harness brackets unbolted, so this one here, so that I can move this harness back and get this cover out this way. I also did this one here. I got the bolt off of this bracket, so I can slide this out of the way, because I'll need to move all that to get this cover out. And then this is connected to the cover in two spots. One is right here on the cover, and the other is back here. This one took me the longest, but I finally got it off. So I needed to get at least that one and this one off to disconnect it from the cover. And I feel like this one and that one's going to make it a little bit easier on me. And as I look at trying to get this cover out, I was really focused on moving this whole wiring harness out of the way. I don't think I'm going to be able to do that. So I slept on it and came up with a new plan. I think I'm going to try to slide the cover out this way and avoid this wiring harness. I may need to take off some of these electrical lines to the fuel injectors and possibly even this fuel rail. I might even have to take out this head, but I'm kind of okay with that to avoid this wiring harness. It goes all the way around and goes into the back that I already plugged back in, so I could disconnect all that. It's got another wire that goes down into something I can't even tell what it is. So then I would pull all that back, and I still am having trouble at this side of the wiring harness, trying to get that big hub right there to lift up it goes all the way down to the back of the engine, and I can't really tell where it's connected. So I don't think I'm gonna be able to lift this all the way up to get this cover out. So rather than work on that, I'm shifting my focus to looking at sliding the cover out this way and hoping that that's gonna work. So with all these disconnected, I'm ready to start taking off the bolts on the valve cover and at least get it off and see how much clearance I'm gonna have. All right, the one that's giving me the most trouble is that back bottom bolt holding on the cover. I have a 3/8 extension on a 10mm socket that is on that bolt right now. I'm gonna go ahead and get it off and then show you how I got that in there. All right, so here's where I put that through. I put it inside this coolant hose, and I was able to get this extension angled just right on that back bolt. So I'm spinning it now. I didn't have to take any of this off, but man, it was difficult to get around all of it. And I'm sitting on top of the engine bay right now with my arm all the way down in there to get this bolt out the rest of the way. All right. There it is. 7 down, 3 to go. So the last 3 shouldn't be too bad. I've still got 1 up here and 2 down here. This is probably the next most difficult one to get to, so it's right next to that back corner bolt. It is the next one over, and I've got a small extension on another smaller extension that has a pivot head, so I can move this around a little bit, but I've got it on that bolt, and I've got it kind of wedged in between this coolant hose, so I was able to fit that in there and get right on top of that bolt, and that swivel head gives me just enough angle to get on the bolt properly. This is a 1/4 drive extension, by the way. I wanted to get the thinnest one I had to try to weasel in here. So that's how I got this one off. That should have been the next hardest one, so I've just got 2 more. All right, that's all the bolts off the valve cover. Next, I'm gonna work on getting these coil packs out. So I'll go ahead and take these off, and then we'll see what we gotta do to get the rest of the cover off. All right, I broke the cover loose, and as I lift it up, the first thing that it's knocking on is this solenoid here. I think this is a VTEC solenoid. I can't remember what this is called. I'll put it up right here. But this is real easy to remove. I've replaced this before. It's just got 3 10mm bolts on the top. So I'm gonna go ahead and take that off and see if it makes it easier for me to get this cover out. You just want to be careful taking this off. There is a gasket on the bottom side. It should be stuck on this, but if you knock that loose, you may have a difficult time getting this back on. Probably be best to replace this gasket. I am not going to do that because mine is stuck to this, and I'm fine with that. All right, so that's going to make it a little easier to get this cover out. I can actually get it up quite a bit further than I could before, so I'm going to see if I can lift this all the way out. Now I'm getting hung up on that wiring harness back there, and I was really hoping that I could just slide this out this way. So I've got it up pretty far, which is good. I'm gonna go ahead and take off these electrical connectors to the fuel injectors and see if that gives me any more room. All right, I got it out. The difficult part is definitely gonna be putting it back in there. So stuff like this, you wanna get out of there if you can. Just little crusty stuff that you do not want inside your engine. I saw somebody say it's a good idea to blow it out with compressed air. I don't really like that idea, but I also know that from doing that one, I did see little flakes of stuff that I just couldn't get out in there, and I don't want that to cause problems, so I may try to clean this one out better than I did that one. And with that cover off, I'm going to do the same thing that I did with the other side. So I will clean up this whole mating surface. I'll scrape off any gasket material that's left over, and I'll get the cover cleaned up and get a new gasket in it, and then put some gasket sealer on these two front corners right before I put the clean cover on with the fresh gasket. So I'm going to go ahead and clean this up and then get to work on that. And I've gone around this whole mating surface with a towel and a plastic razor blade and cleaned up as much as I could. There's quite a bit left on this one. I didn't have as much on the other side, but now I'm going to go at it with a metal razor blade very carefully, very slowly, and making sure not to score any of this aluminum block. So this here's a really good example of how much pressure, how slowly and lightly I'm scraping this gasket material off of here. I'm going to try to scrape it out of the engine rather than into it, but there's only so much you can do there. But I'm just going to make sure I take my time. I go as lightly as I possibly can. And my number one objective is to not scratch this aluminum head. I did go ahead and change out the screw on this camshaft position sensor. I didn't have to change the sensor because I already did that a while ago. But this tiny 10mm wrench is coming in handy for this. So that is what I used to get the old one out and put this new one in. So I would recommend changing those out while you're in here, because that one was terrible to get to. And looking at everything that's so close to it, I don't know how I did that with the cover and everything else on there. I didn't take anything off when I did it, and I remember it being pretty difficult. So it is way easier when you got this all opened up like this to go ahead and do those camshaft position sensors. So I will link those in the description, as well as these tiny wrenches. These are awesome. I've used them quite a bit now, so I've definitely got my money's worth out of these. And with that sensor changed out and the mating surface cleaned up, I'm ready to install the new gasket. So I will clean this one up and change out the gasket the same way I did the other one. And with the cover cleaned and the new gasket in, I'm ready to work on getting some of this gasket material out of here, and then I will be ready to put some new gasket sealer in and put the valve cover on. So there's a little bit left that I wasn't able to get with the plastic razor blade, so I'm going to use a regular razor blade and just go very carefully. And get up the rest of this. There we go. So I'll just take my time and get the rest of this off. Alright, so I scraped on these two corners quite a bit. That one down there too. I got them pretty clean. So in this corner there's still some gasket material down here. And I can't really get all that up, but I'm okay with that because the cover mates up right here, and this is where the gasket goes. So as long as this is cleared off, I'm good with that. I did the same on the other side. I did the best I could. It looks like there's still a little bit of gasket material right here, and I felt like I was starting to cut into the actual mating surface, so I just stopped. I'm hoping that'll be good enough. I'd like to get some of this off if I could, but using the metal razor blade, I was just too scared of cutting into this surface. And if I do that and cause an oil leak, then I've got a huge problem. So I'd rather be careful and conservative and know that if I didn't get enough of this off, the worst that's going to happen is there's still going to be an oil leak, and then I can take it back off and address that. But if I cut into this surface, then I don't really know what the solution is at that point. So I'm good with how this looks. I cleaned it off, it's dry. And I've got the new gasket into the cover. So I'm ready to get this on. I'll just put some gasket sealer in these two spots and then get the cover back on. So I did push this gasket down into the cover, and I feel like it's going to stay in there. I saw a lot of videos where people were saying you have to tie fishing line around the whole cover to try to keep the gasket in there as you put the cover back on. I did not have to do that on this side. The gasket was in the cover enough to hold itself in place while I flipped it over and put it on. So I'm hoping it's going to be the same on this side. I think the problem is that I have less clearance, so I am going to have to kind of wiggle it in there, but I think that'll be okay. I'm hoping this gasket will stay in place and I won't have to try something like that fishing line trick that I saw. But if you have that problem, you can do that. You can wrap fishing line around kind of these areas, and then I would put the cover on, and then once you've got it on, maybe thread some of the bolts in a little bit and then cut the fishing line and try to pull it out without pulling out the gasket. I don't like the idea of that, so I'm going to try to do it without doing that, and we'll see how that goes. Also, if you're afraid of putting the gasket sealer in and then trying to get the cover in and feeling like you can't get it in there and worrying about smearing the gasket sealer or it curing before you get the cover in, you can try a dry fit. So you can try to put this in and get it in there before you put the gasket sealer in, just to know how you're going to do it. Take it back out and then put the gasket sealer in and put the cover back on. You can do that if you want to. I'm not going to. That was a fear of mine the first time I did these, and I actually did a dry fit on my Honda, and I liked trying that first just to make sure I knew how it was going to go in there. This one's going to be so difficult to get in there that I think I'd spend more time doing the dry fit and taking it out than I will just going ahead and putting the gasket sealer in and seeing how I get it in there. So that's what I'm going to do, but you can try a dry fit if you're a little hesitant about putting that gasket sealer in there and then hurrying up to put the cover in. Alright, so that was more difficult than I thought, but I think I got it in. So I ended up putting some gasket sealer in between the gasket and the cover. I don't like doing that. I wished I didn't do it. I don't like showing you that I did it, but there was no other way for me to get that gasket to stay inside the cover while I snaked it in there. So I tried to get a video of me doing it. It was pretty poor, and I was under a time crunch because I didn't want that gasket sealer to cure. So I had to take it back out, put some gasket sealer in between the gasket and the top cover, and that allowed me to hold it into place well enough that once I got it under this wiring harness, I could set it there and then feel around and make sure that the gasket was still inside the cover. I did have to put it back in the back and in that back corner especially. I'm still not 100% sure that it's in there correctly. I can feel under this way and feel the gasket over here feels good, and it feels good on the back too. So I'm really hoping that all of that is seated properly. And that was eventually how I got it in there. And then I went ahead and put all the bolts in and tightened them down in the correct pattern. So I will show the correct pattern now. This is the order in which you should tighten these bolts down. You go through all of them once at a certain torque spec that's on there, and then you go through them again with another. And I didn't exactly do that. I just kind of tightened them down in the order that I remember it being, and then went around, tightened them down again. You do want to go through each of them a couple of times, because as you tighten those down, you'll get to the one that you started with and it is really loose and you got to tighten it down more. So you definitely want to at least do that. But I did get all of them tightened down. I believe the gasket is in there properly and the valve cover is seated and bolted down and tightened down. So like I said, the way I got it in there, I kind of slid it in this way, had the front sticking up, and tried to get that back corner in underneath this wiring harness. I felt underneath it to make sure that the gasket was still seated in the cover, and then I slowly pushed it down and double checked the whole time, making sure the gasket was still seated in the cover properly. But the good news is I did get it in there. I feel like it's good. I won't know until I put everything back together and start it up and see if there's still an oil leak. But that was definitely the most difficult part of all this. I don't know how else you're supposed to do it other than remove this wiring harness, and I don't know how to get it detached from back there. So I did get it. It did work. It took a little bit of time and I was in a bit of a panic, but I think I got it. So at this point, I'll put the coils back in, get those plugged in, plug some of the rest of this stuff in, and get these wiring harnesses bolted down, and we'll go from there. I'm going to start with putting this hose back. To get this hose back on all the way, it's pretty rigid, so it's a little bit difficult to get back all the way on to these fittings, but I found it helpful to put a pry bar in between here, and that will push it all the way until it clicks on to this little ridge right here is where the hose is supposed to go to. So it's pretty difficult to push back all the way onto these, but using a pry bar right here gave me enough leverage to get that back on. Next, I'm going to put these fuel injector plugs back in. You want to make sure this tab right here is on the bottom, and these will click right in. And you should have some clips that go back into these holes. Next, I'll put this VVT solenoid back on. And I'll put the coils back in. I'll go ahead and get the bolt back in this wiring harness onto this valve cover. So I've got the smallest ratchet that I can find. All right, and that is about as tight as I can get it. It doesn't need to be super tight. It's just threading into a brass threaded fitting on a plastic valve cover, so it doesn't need to be super tight, but that is secured now. So now I can go ahead and plug in these coil electrical connections. Let's start with that one. There was a wiring harness that I disconnected from here for the other two that has a bracket that threads into that brass fitting on the cover. So I'll make sure that I can get that fastened. All right, so that is tight as well. I don't want to tighten it down too much, but that looks pretty good. So I can plug this back in and then tuck this wiring harness underneath these two for the plug on the VTEC solenoid. So obviously these plugs reach to where they're supposed to go, but you just want to make sure you plug these into the correct locations. So I got this coil plugged in, and then this one that reaches up to the front, I'll just plug this one in. and you'll hear it click when you plug it in, so that's how you know it's in properly. And then this connector here goes right here on that VVT solenoid. So I stuffed this under here, and then the plug is going right where it needs to. Really should have plugged this in before I attached this. There we go. There's also a hose that goes on top of this. I had pulled that off, so I will get that back on now too. So that's where that hose is gonna go. There we go. And I'm going to use my needle nose pliers to get that constant tension clamp back where it's supposed to be. So you do not want to put your finger on that clamp as you open it up and push it down, because it'll snap shut and you do not want to pinch your finger. I think this will be a little easier with my tiny crescent wrench, so I'll try this. Alright, that's close, so I just need to spin it around and try to get it in the indentation that it was in before. If I can't, it's not the end of the world, but you want to try to put these right back the same way that they were so you avoid leaks. Sorry I can't get a good shot of that, but I did get the clamp for this hose connected back to that plastic fitting that sticks out of the valve cover. So I don't see much else that I need to connect over here that I took off. There's this and this that are going to connect to the plenum when I put it back on, but I think everything else is tightened down except for these brackets for this wiring harness. So I have 2 bolts left for this bracket here and this one here. So I'll go ahead and tighten this one down while I've got easy access to it. All this feels way easier to put back on than it did to take off. Alright, so I will tighten that one down. I would certainly recommend one of these tiny ratchets for this and a lot of other things. You want to get the smallest ratchet you can to fit into things, and this one's been perfect for a lot of these bolts that are kind of difficult to get to. So I will link this tiny ratchet in the description. So I just have 1 bolt left. I'm pretty sure it goes to this bracket here. And I think the last bolt goes to this bracket here, so I'm going to go ahead and reattach that. I'm guessing that's right because it was longer than the rest of them and it didn't bottom out, so pretty sure that's where that one went. So there we go. The wiring harness is connected again. So at this point I'm ready to start with this lower plenum. There is a gasket underneath that goes on top of these cylinders where I have the tape. So I can go ahead and take that tape off and put that new gasket on the underside of the bottom plenum. So before I do that, I would like to clean this up a little bit. It's pretty sludgy, and I'm pretty sure it's not supposed to look like that. But there is that gasket for the underside of this, and it just comes off real easy. So I will leave it like that, clean this up, and put the new one on. So this gasket does have a specific orientation. The front of it has these 2 arrows. And I noticed those same 2 arrows right here. The backside doesn't have those, so this only goes on one way. So you want to make sure when you take it off that you remember how it was oriented so that you can get the new one on the same way that this was on, with those 2 arrows facing forward on the right side of this gasket underneath that plenum. So I'm going to go ahead and clean this up and then I'll get this back on. Well, I wish there was a better way to clean this up, but I think that's about as good as I'm going to get it. So a quick tip when cleaning this, I stuck a zip tie through this tube and I can pull it out the other side. And then I can twirl this around and just make sure that there's no blockages in this air line. So with all that gunk, this is pretty much a pinch point. So if you can rotate it, and that way you can clear out that line and make sure that it's clear. You can also blow compressed air into it. So I guess that looks good enough. I wish I could get it cleaner, but I don't think I'm going to be able to. And I'd really like to get this done, so I think I'm going to call that good enough and just make sure that this surface for the gasket on top is clean. So I can also put the new gasket on top of this that will replace this one. This one's very similar in that it has one specific orientation. It does have these triangles on the front on this tab, and so that means it's going to go on just like this. And I'm ready to go ahead and take that masking tape off and get this new gasket on and get that lower plenum on. So as I take this off, I'm going to peel off one side and let all that debris fall down in where that fuel rail is. I've got this microfiber towel that I've been using to clean off mating surfaces. So I'll clean this off one more time. So in case you confuse easily like I do, this gasket actually has 2 layers, and this new one is held together with some brass rivets. And I checked the old one and it actually has 2 layers too. It doesn't have any rivets on it. So that is one gasket with 2 layers. And I can just set that in where it's supposed to go. And it fits in the notches for these threaded posts. So it will sit right where it's supposed to be. I do want to wipe off this surface just one more time before I put it down on there. And I'm going to put the back hole on that back post first, and then I'll be able to line up the front one a lot easier. Alright, so the back is lined up. The front, I need to pull that breather tube forward a little bit to get that to slide into place. So I'll go ahead and get these nuts on those threaded posts. And I'll go ahead and tighten these down. Before I tighten it down, I wanted to get this hose connected in case I didn't have enough slack and I had to take that back off, but I was able to bend it and get it on. So I'm just going to tighten these down a little bit and then kind of switch back and forth until I get them to feel the same. Alright, so with that covering the holes into the engine, I'm going to blow this off one more time to make sure there's no debris in there that's going to get sucked down in there as soon as I start it. Alright, so next I've got this plate with these 6 bolts. And I've also got 3 wiring harness bracket bolts that go along this side. So I'll go ahead and get all that on. This plate does have an arrow pointing forward, so that's pointing to the front of the engine to let you know which way to orient this. Alright, I got that on there. That was pretty self-explanatory. So I will tighten these down in the correct order. I'll start with this one here. But first I will get these all hand tight, and then I will tighten them down. And I'll go ahead and put these harness bolts back in. I've got the 2 for the fuel lines back here, and 1 for this wiring harness here. And I'll just lower this onto the posts. There we go. This also has a specific pattern. You start with these center bolts and then do the outside bolts in a specific pattern. I'll post that now too. I learned in looking at those torque specs and bolt patterns that this is actually called the intake controller. So this is the upper intake controller and the lower intake controller. Every video I watched called these a plenum, so that's what I've been calling them. And when you install that, you want to make sure that you don't snag this oil catcher. That's what this piece is called. And so now I'll put all the bolts where they're supposed to go on this upper intake controller and then get all those tightened down. While I have this loose, I'm going to go ahead and pop this line back on by the throttle body that I had a spark plug stuck into. So that should be easy right now. It was a lot easier than I thought it was going to be. So I went ahead and took that spark plug out of that line and plugged it into underneath where the throttle body is going to go while all this is loose. And I will use my small pliers to move the compression fitting for that line as well. So there it is, just underneath where the throttle body is going to go. So this is a great time to remind you to get some hose clearance pliers before you do this. And also a better workload. There we go. After trying 7 different pliers, finally got that clamp back on. So please get a set of hose clamp pliers if you're going to do this. And there's this hose on the other side of the engine. These seem to be my best substitution for hose clamp pliers. Alright, there we go. Alright, back at it. This is day 5. Where I left off, I had gotten that hose back on, and I still need to get this one back onto the bottom of the throttle body. I did get all the bolts in, and they're all loose, but I did get these in. And I'll tell you the reason why I left them loose. I got all of these in the way that you're supposed to, so in order up here and then in order all the way around. And I got all the way back to this one and I couldn't get it to thread into the hole that it goes into. So I had to loosen all these back up, lift it up, and get that bolt to go in. After I did that, I tightened it all back down again and realized I had this oil catcher stuck under this upper lid. So I had to loosen them all back up again and pull this out. So that's where I'm at now. I left them all loose. I would recommend leaving all of these loose until you at least get them all started. I would make sure that you can get that one started because that one there gave me the most trouble. So now I'm ready to connect this hose here and then tighten all these down in order. I'm gonna go ahead and do that real quick. Even though these have a specific order, you wanna make sure you get them all threaded in first. Don't tighten them down even loosely because you need some room to wiggle this thing around to make sure that you can get all these bolts in. But that one there was a pain. So I'll go ahead and get that hose on and then tighten all these down. All right, there we go. Got them all torqued down in the order that you're supposed to. So I should go back through and recheck them all. So I'm gonna do that real quick. Next, I can go ahead and put this throttle body back on. I've got the gasket on this side with the bolts through it, and I'll just stick it right on there and start these bolts. You do torque these down in a specific pattern as well. I will put that up here now. And I'll get this electrical connector back on. All right, now I'm ready to get this airbox back in. So I missed that hose clamp there, and then also this one here. So I'm gonna get that connected. So real quick, I'm just gonna do a visual and go through and make sure that everything looks as it's supposed to. I feel like I got everything. I don't have any leftover bolts, which is amazing. And I feel like everything looks pretty good. So I will go ahead and get that top cover on, and then we'll clean everything out. Make sure we didn't leave any wrenches, sockets, and whatever else in the engine bay. I will reconnect the battery and we'll start it up and check for oil leaks. All right, guys, and with that, I think we're done. So I think I got everything reconnected. I double and triple checked everything that I can see at this point. Battery is reconnected. There are a couple of procedures that it tells you to do whenever you remove the throttle body. So one of them is relearning the throttle position, and there's a couple others that I will list here. I will try to do the throttle position relearning because it looks pretty easy. So I'll do that next before I start it up. So it says put the key in, turn it to on, and right back off, and then listen for the throttle plate to move. So I'm going to try that and see if it actually works. So I'll turn the key to on and then back off, and I did not hear anything. So that test was a fail. So at this point I'm ready to start it up and check for oil leaks. All right, I don't see any oil leaking. I was really concerned about this back corner, but everything looks okay. All right, I looked at everything I can see up here and everything looks good so far. I do not have any oil leaks underneath, so that's good news too. Guys, I think we did it. So I'm gonna let it go ahead and get up to operating temperature, and then I'm gonna turn it off, let it sit for a minute, and then check the oil level. But I think we're good. So I pulled it out of the garage to clean up the floor and make it easier for me to check for oil leaks, and it literally just started pouring rain. So now I'm dripping water everywhere, and it's really difficult to look for any oil leaks. But I didn't see any when I had it in here running. I didn't see any in the driveway before it started raining. I did get it up to operating temperature, so I will let it sit for a minute and check the oil level, but I think we're good. In the meantime, I'm gonna gather up all my tools. I'll show you guys everything that I used or tried to use. All right, and last thing is to check the oil. Put it back in, make sure it's flush. And our oil level looks good. All right, I will periodically check the oil level just to make sure that I'm not leaking oil, but I think everything looks good initially. So I guess if you guys have made it this far, then you'd like to see all the tools that I used. So I will go through all of this real quick. It's really not that much to do something like this. I really probably didn't need some of this, but I'll go through it real quick. Always make sure you've got gloves and safety glasses, some cleaners, degreaser, and I actually didn't even use brake cleaner. I used a lot of that foaming engine degreaser, but I only needed 1 can of that. A pry tool, some needle nose pliers, ratchets of different sizes. The tiny one, huge all-star in this job. 22mm wrench I don't think I needed. Tiny pry bar, some sockets of various sizes. I think I really only used a 10 and an 8. And then that 5mm hex socket. Long 10mm impact socket was also an all-star in this job. Shout out to the spark plug for helping me not leak coolant. Ratcheting wrench, 8 and 10mm extensions of different sizes. One thing I will definitely recommend that you get, maybe not just for this job, but for a lot of things, are these AC Delco battery powered ratchet and drill. These are awesome. Ever since I got these, I've been using them on everything and I really like them. Some adapters. That ratchet just had my 5-inch half-drive extension on it. Some brushes, a wire brush, and this one's like a toothbrush. I get those at the dollar store. A tiny brush, no idea where that came from. Universal adapters, 1/2 to 3/8 and 3/8 to 1/4. A half-drive adapter for my drill. Pocket screwdriver, some picks, a 90-degree pick, and then this other weird one. Scrubber brush to scrub the valve cover. Some panel fasteners. A work light. Some short half-drive sockets with a hex on the backside. I like these too. Plastic razor blade, all-star in this job. Metal razor blade was also necessary. I used a Scotch-Brite pad to try to clean off some of that gasket material. Some different pliers, some clamping pliers, adjustable pliers, some cutters. Tiny wrenches. Get you some tiny wrenches. These are awesome when you need them. Tiny hex bit ratchet. This is the scraper that the plastic razor blade came with. I don't know where I got that. Some more clamping pliers, some screwdrivers, and Honda Bond. I would recommend getting Permatex Gasket Sealer. This is just what I had on hand, so that's what I used. And a torque wrench. I would recommend getting a inch-pound torque wrench, not a foot-pound torque wrench. Most of those were 72 inch-pounds to 80-some inch-pounds, which was basically 7 to 9 foot-pounds, so I had to turn this thing down as far as I could get it, and if I could do it over again, I would get an inch-pound torque wrench. The gasket set that I got, it also came with these gaskets. These are below something that I didn't take off, so I didn't actually replace these. Probably would have been a good idea to replace those in hindsight, but I would recommend getting that kit to replace those two metal gaskets on the upper and lower intake controller. I got this breather tube to replace that one that was crusty that linked one valve cover to the other. I didn't need it. This was the one that I found online. Somebody said this one will work. It's shaped a little bit different, which is why I didn't want to use it. This may work. I'm going to return this, but it is Dorman part number 46012. In case you need to replace the breather tube, and a ton of rags, a kitty litter pan. That's pretty much it. Everything that I used is right here. Even some stuff I tried and didn't really need. So it looks like a lot, but as you start working on cars, you'll accumulate tools when you need them. I just buy things as I need them. So like these battery powered ratchet and drill, I just bought recently. I've never needed them. They just make things easier. And that's the point that I've gotten to, where I'm buying tools to make things easier rather than what I need. These were kind of the same thing. I bought these because I thought they were cool, and they've come in clutch quite a few times. And last but not least, I can't forget the zip tie that I used to clean out that breather tube. So that's everything. Not too bad, really. And all of that I needed just to change out this part here. That stupid valve cover gasket. Now, in this valve cover gasket's defense, I did change out these also. I also changed out this camshaft position sensor and put new screws on those camshaft position sensors, but this is really all the parts that I changed out. And hopefully that will solve my oil leak problem. With that, I thank you guys for watching. I really appreciate you checking out my channel. I want to encourage you to try something if you think you can't do it. So I'll be honest, I really didn't know if I could do this. There was parts of it that I got really discouraged. One of the reasons I took 5 days to do it is because when I get to a point where I get stuck, I just take a break. I sleep on it and I come back at it and have new ideas. It's a great suggestion that I got from somebody who's near and dear to my heart, and I would recommend doing that. So if you got to take 5 days on a job, and you can do that, but I can tell you eventually you'll figure it out, you'll get it, and you won't have to listen to yourself when you think, I might need to take this to somebody and have them fix my problem. I've done that a few times and I've never had to do it, so you can do it, guys. So with that, that's really it. Thanks for watching. And if you made it this far, make sure that you send me an email to benwrenchinyt@gmail.com and let me know where you want me to send your free sticker to. I got some stickers. I think they're pretty cool. If you guys have questions, drop them in the comments and I will respond to you as soon as I see them. But that's it for this video. Thanks guys for watching, and I'll catch you guys in the next video.